They hadn't heard a knock in 20 years. But when 3 starving children appeared at their door, something inside them stirred, something long buried. Love, hope, and a chance to be called Mom and Dad. The knock came just after sundown, 3 short raps, brittle and uncertain. Silence had ruled the adobe house for 2 decades, so the sound echoed like a gunshot. Elias rose slowly from the chair by the fireplace, his joints stiff, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at his wife. Clara didn't move. Her hands, wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, trembled only slightly. "Did you hear it?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, eyes still on the door. "Go slow." He always did. The years had worn away everything sharp in Elias, save for his wariness. The desert had taught him patience, but it had also taught him to fear the unexpected. He crossed the room in careful steps, pausing just long enough to slip his hand around the old hunting rifle that leaned against the wall. He didn't lift it, only held it loosely as he opened the door. What he saw made the rifle drop. 3 children stood beneath the wide, purple sky, outlined by the last remnants of sunlight. The oldest, a boy maybe 12 or 13, stood in front with his shoulders squared as if shielding the others. Behind him, a girl with tangled braids clutched a smaller child, a toddler who didn't cry, didn't move, just stared with eyes too wide and too tired for her years. Clara was already behind Elias, breath catching in her throat. The boy's voice cracked when he spoke. "We walked, no more food." Elias opened the door wider without a word. Clara stepped past him, skirts brushing the floor, and dropped to her knees. Her fingers barely touched the smallest girl's cheek. "She's burning up." The middle child clung tighter to the little one, as if afraid Clara might take her away. Elias set the rifle aside. "Come in," he said. "Now." The boy didn't move at first. It wasn't fear. It was pride, worn thin but still standing. He held Clara's gaze, then Elias, before giving a small nod and guiding his sisters inside. They brought nothing. No bags, no shoes on the youngest, just clothes that clung to them like damp rags and the smell of sunburned earth. Clara moved fast, sharper than she had in years, pulling blankets from the old cedar chest and placing them near the fire. Elias fetched water, scooping it from the cooled kettle on the stove and offering the tin cup first to the boy. "My name's Elias," he said. "This is Clara." The boy hesitated, then drank deeply. "I'm Jesse," he said between gulps. "She's Ruth and the baby's May." Clara's hands shook as she unwrapped May's thin arms from Ruth's grip. The child's skin was hot to the touch, her lips cracked and colorless. "How long have you been out there?" Clara whispered, half to herself. 2 days walking, Jesse answered. "Before that, we were at the Ridgetown mission. They ran out of food." Elias swore under his breath, but caught himself before letting anything foul slip. Instead, he turned to the stove and started breaking kindling into the firebox. The warmth was already spreading through the cabin, but the kind of cold in those children's bones would take more than flames to chase away. Dinner was a thin barley soup, nothing fancy, but the way Jesse ate it made Elias wish he'd made more. Ruth barely touched hers until Clara coaxed her, gently spooning broth toward her lips like she used to do when they still hoped for babies of their own. Elias watched Clara move, saw how her shoulders squared again, how her voice took on that soft edge she hadn't used in 20 years. She hadn't just buried their stillborn daughter out in the desert clay. She de-buried the part of herself that believed she could still mother anything. Until now. When May whimpered in her sleep, Clara didn't flinch. She simply lifted the baby closer, tucked her beneath the folds of her shawl, and rocked without thinking. Night fell heavy and quiet. The children curled into quilts near the hearth, their bodies exhausted beyond fight. Elias and Clara sat at the table, neither speaking at first. The fire popped, casting long shadows that danced across the clay walls. 3 of them, Elias said finally. No parents. Jesse had said nothing more about their past. He hadn't needed to. Elias had seen it in the boy's eyes, the way he watched the door, the way his hand hovered near anything he could use to protect his sisters. "Not anymore," Clara murmured. They let the silence return, but this time it was different. It wasn't the crushing silence of years spent alone. It was the quiet of something beginning. When dawn broke, Clara was already up, heating water, slicing the last of the winter apples. Elias walked outside to split kindling and found Jessie already hauling wood from the stack, teeth gritted against the cold. "You don't need to," Elias started. "I do," Jessie said. Elias nodded. He remembered being that boy once, too proud, too scared to stop moving. They worked side by side without speaking. The desert sun crept higher, shedding light on everything the night had covered. Inside, Clara helped Ruth wash. The girl flinched when water touched her skin but never pulled away. When Clara gently combed through the knots in her hair, Ruth looked up. "Is it okay if we stay a little longer?" she asked in a voice so small it made Clara's throat close. "Of course," Clara said and kissed the girl's forehead. "As long as you need." The door creaked as Elias stepped back in. He looked from Clara to the girls, then at Jessie, who stood awkwardly behind him. "You all hungry again?" he asked. Ruth smiled. That afternoon, Clara sat on the porch with May asleep in her arms and Ruth pressed against her side. Elias leaned against the doorway, watching Jessie toss scraps to the chickens. 3 children had arrived on their doorstep, uninvited and nearly lost. But somehow it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something they hadn't dared to hope for. Elias had always been a man of few words, but over the next few days he found himself saying even less. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because every time he looked at the children, especially Jessie, there was something unspoken between them. A quiet understanding that didn't need words. It was in the way Jessie rose early, never being told, always watching, always moving. It was in the way Ruth stuck close to Clara's skirts like a shadow that finally found light, and in how May had learned to sleep again, nestled against Clara's chest as though she'd never known a world before her arms. The desert was still cruel, dry winds cutting sharp at dawn, sand sticking to the sweat of hard labor, but something shifted in the house. It wasn't just the noise, though that was part of it. Where once only the howling wind and creaking floorboards had kept Elias and Clara company, now there were giggles, spilled porridge, stifled cries in the night, and whispered prayers from Ruth, whose voice, barely louder than a sigh, carried more weight than a church bell. The girl prayed the way a child would, without structure, without the heavy words of the Bible, but with raw honesty. "Thank you for the bread," she'd whisper at the table. "Thank you that May's not coughing anymore. Please don't let Jessie go away. And please let Clara and Elias want us." Clara never corrected her. She just placed her hand on the girl's back and bowed her head, her own eyes full. By the 5th day, Clara had unpacked the sewing kit that hadn't seen sunlight in 20 years. She mended Ruth's torn skirt and started on a little tunic for May, humming softly as she worked. When Elias walked past her in the parlor, he caught the sound and paused. The tune was familiar, from a time when they thought they'd be parents themselves. "Didn't think I'd hear that again," he said, not unkindly. Clara didn't look up, but her fingers didn't stop moving. "Didn't think I'd remember how." Elias stood there for a long time before he moved on. That night, he added more wood to the fire than usual, and when May cried in her sleep, he was the first to reach her. But peace, like rain in the desert, was a rare and brief gift. On the 7th morning, a rider appeared on the horizon. Elias spotted him before the others did. Leaning against the fence with a mug of black coffee, he narrowed his eyes as the lone figure kicked up dust. Jessie came up beside him, instinctively placing himself between the gate and the house. "You know him?" Jessie asked, squinting. "Not yet." The man drew closer, slow but deliberate, his horse thin and tired, his hat low over his brow. When he reached the front of the house, he didn't dismount immediately. He just sat there studying the place. Then he spoke. "Got word you took in some strays." Clara came to the door, Ruth peeking out from behind her. "Depends who's asking," Elias said. The rider pushed back his hat, revealing a gaunt face sharp as broken glass. "Name's Connell. I work with the circuit preacher out of Broken Bluff. Been tracking where the Ridgetown kids scattered after the mission ran dry. Heard 3 went missing." Jesse stiffened, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not talking them," Elias said plainly. "I ain't here to take 'em," Connell replied. "I'm here to see if they're all right. Maybe get a message back to what's left of that mission, and to let you know, not everyone's thrilled about kids disappearing." Elias took a long, slow breath. They didn't disappear. They walked, for days, with no food, no shoes for the little one. They made it here by sheer will. Connell finally slid from his horse. "I don't doubt it, I've heard worse, but I gotta ask, are you planning to keep them?" Clara came down the steps. "We haven't decided anything," she said softly, "but we're feeding them, clothing them. They sleep under this roof now, that's enough for today." Connell looked at Jesse. "You okay, boy?" Jesse didn't answer. "He's fine," Elias said. Connell studied them a moment longer, then gave a tight nod. "Well, if they're safe, I'll ride on, but word travels. You ought to prepare for someone less kind knocking next." Clara's voice was firm now. "We'll manage." Connell remounted. "That you will, Lord help you." As the rider vanished into the heat shimmer, Elias exhaled slowly. Jesse turned to him, face flushed. "Do we have to go?" "No," Elias said, "not unless you want to." Jesse didn't respond. He didn't need to. But the seed of worry had been planted, and all that week, Clara watched the horizon the way she once watched for clouds during drought, praying for none, fearing one might come. That night Ruth had another nightmare. She woke screaming, clawing at the sheets, gasping for someone named Leela. Clara was there in an instant, holding her close, rocking her through sobs. "She was our baby sister," Jesse said quietly, standing in the hallway. "She didn't make it." Elias looked at him, the fire's reflection dancing in his tired eyes. "You carry too much for your age." Jesse's jaw tightened. "There's no one else to carry it." "Not anymore," Elias said. "That's not true anymore." Ruth finally settled, curling into Clara's lap like a kitten finally safe. Clara smoothed her hair, whispering nonsense songs, and Elias looked away, swallowing hard. He thought about the grave outside, the one under the flat stone with no name, just a date that marked the day their daughter was born and died. He thought about the silence that had followed, year after year, and how it had felt easier to let that silence swallow them whole than to try again. Until now. May had begun to babble, soft, incoherent, but joyful. She toddled through the rooms, reaching for Clara's hand or Elia's pant leg, giggling when she caught them. Ruth followed Clara everywhere, asking questions, helping to stir porridge or sweep dust. Jesse worked beside Elias in the fields, learning to repair fence wire and how to hitch the stubborn mule to the cart. Every evening they sat around the table. Elias started saying grace again, his voice rough but steady. "Thank you, Lord, for this bread, for the hands that grew it, for those who share it." It wasn't poetry, but it was something, a beginning. On the 10th night, Clara lay awake, her hand resting on Elia's chest. "You think we could ever be more than just a stop on their way?" she asked. Elias turned to her. "I think maybe we already are." She pressed her face into his shoulder, and for the first time in 2 decades she cried, not out of grief, not out of loneliness, but out of something that felt a little like hope. Outside, the wind howled like it always did. But inside, for the first time in a long time, the house was full. Of noise. Of life. Of something like family. The next morning began like any other, with sand in the air and chill in the bones. but the rhythm of the house had shifted, even if the desert stayed the same. Clara moved with more certainty now, more life. She woke before dawn to knead bread by hand, humming faint tunes from a youth long gone. Jessie fetched water before the sun crested the horizon, and Ruth followed Clara like a shadow, offering to sweep or sort beans or mind May. Elias said little as always, but every time he passed Clara's kitchen or heard May giggle through the open door, his eyes softened a little more. Still, something hung in the air that none of them wanted to name, a tension like the hush before a storm. Clara noticed it first in the way Jessie checked the window more than usual, or how he paused in his chores as if listening for something far off. She said nothing, but she felt it too, that the peace might not hold forever. One evening, as orange light bled across the sky, and the family sat around the table with the smell of stew thick in the room, Jessie put his spoon down and looked at Elias directly. "If someone came for us, would you send us away?" It was Ruth who froze. Her hand trembled, spoon hovering midair. Clara's heart stopped. Elias, slow and careful, wiped his mouth with a rag and leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "Someone already came," he said, "and you're still here." "That man said others might come," Jessie pressed. "Not men with questions, men with badges or worse." Elias met his gaze evenly. "Let M come." "But you think I didn't count the cost before I let you in? I knew the minute I saw your eyes, yours and Ruth's and that little girl's, that if I opened that door, it wasn't for one night. You came looking for more than shelter, and I let you in knowing I might not be able to protect you from everything, but I'll sure try." Ruth pushed her chair back and climbed into Clara's lap. Clara wrapped her arms around her without a word. Jessie's mouth twitched, like he was trying not to cry but failing. "All right," he whispered, "all right then." After supper, they sat outside under the stars. May clapped at the sight of a flickering lantern hung on the porch and babbled in a language only toddlers understood. Elias sat whittling a piece of cedar. Jessie sat beside him, quietly watching. "Where'd you learn to carve?" Jessie finally asked. "My pa," Elias replied, "taught me after my chores, said a man ought to know how to make something from nothing." Jessie nodded. "Can you show me?" Elias handed him the knife without a word. That night Clara watched them through the window, the boy learning a craft he didn't know he needed, the man giving without fanfare, and she closed her eyes with a prayer on her lips. "Lord, please don't take this from them. Not yet, let them stay." But prayers aren't always answered the way we want. The next morning, while the wind howled louder than usual and Ruth cried when she scraped her knee against the floorboard, a sound rose over the hills, hooves. 2 riders this time, no dust cloud like Connell's approach. These ones moved with purpose, calculated. They came to the gate and stopped. Elias walked out alone. The taller man wore a dark coat and a star on his chest, dulled with age but unmistakable. "Elias Moore?" he asked. Elias nodded. "I'm Marshal Greaves. This here's Deputy Lang." "Marshal," Elias said, voice flat. "We got word you took in 3 runaways from Ridgetown Mission. Boy, girl, baby, you confirm?" "I confirm I took in 3 children. Their names and past weren't my first concern." Lang spat in the dust. "They were placed there by the territory for a reason. Can't just let M walk." Elias crossed his arms. "You gonna take them back?" The marshal paused. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether they're safe here, fed, not being mistreated, whether you've applied for guardianship, whether this is gonna be some bleeding heart story gone sideways." "You've got eyes," Elias said. "Use M." Clara came out just then, Ruth clinging to her skirts, Jessie behind her like a shadow, May on her hip. The marshal looked at them, Ruth hiding, May blinking at the new faces, Jessie standing with his chin up trying to look older than he was. Lang scoffed, "Don't look like they belong here." Clara stepped forward, calm as ever. They didn't, but now they do. The marshal sighed. Look, I'm not here to tear apart something good, but you gotta understand, if the wrong person finds out, if someone from the old mission or the territory decides to push. We'll cross that when we must, Elias said, but I won't send them off like livestock. The marshal nodded slowly. All right then, I'll file the visit as a welfare check, but if I were you, I'd start on papers, guardianship, make it legal. Lang muttered under his breath but didn't argue. Clara offered them water, which they both declined. Before they left, the marshal tipped his hat toward Ruth. You be good now, little one. Ruth said nothing, but held Clara tighter. As the riders vanished, Jesse turned to Elias. What if papers aren't enough? They'll have to be, Elias replied, because I'm not giving you up. Inside that night, things were quieter, not tense, just thoughtful. Jesse sat at the table with the carving knife again, but his hands shook. Elias steadied them. You're not weak, Elias said. You're just young, that's no shame. I'm tired of being young, Jesse replied. I know. Clara braided Ruth's hair that night. May fell asleep in her lap, and after everyone was tucked in, Clara and Elias sat together on the porch, watching the desert breathe in the dark. We need to send for papers, Clara said. Elias nodded. I'll ride to town tomorrow. She leaned against him. They're not guests anymore. They never were. The desert wind picked up. Far off, a coyote howled. Jesse didn't sleep that night. He stood at the window, watching the stars, listening for hooves, ready to run again if he had to. But the night passed quiet. The morning came with peace. And with it, a letter. Connell's name was on the outside. Inside, a short message scrawled in tight script. Heard there's trouble brewing in Ridgetown. Territories deciding what to do with the failed mission. Keep your papers close, and keep the children closer. Jesse read it, lips tight. Means someone might still come, he said. Clara set the letter down, then let them come. Elias took Jesse's shoulder. We don't run anymore. Jesse looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Outside, the wind howled again. But inside, the walls held firm. And so did they. A week passed, maybe more. The desert had its own way of keeping time, measuring in cracked earth, in worn bootsteps, in the way shadows stretched thinner day by day. In the Moore household, though, something else marked the days now. Routine. Mornings meant Clara at the stove, humming to herself while Jesse chopped kindling and Ruth fed scraps to the hens. May toddled around barefoot, trailing crumbs and squeals, filling silence that had once soaked the walls like damp. Evenings brought light, lamplight, firelight, the flicker of hope, and always Elias, steady as ever, watching over them as if he knew how quickly such peace could slip. But the peace held, at least on the surface. Underneath, Jesse grew quieter, not withdrawn, not sullen, but watchful. He'd taken to riding out past the edge of the ranch, beyond the hills, eyes scanning the empty. Connell's letter hadn't left his thoughts. Ridgetown mission was being shuttered, which should have been good news, but it meant records were being moved, stories stirred. And sometimes, when governments couldn't erase a failure, they buried it, along with whoever reminded them of it. One morning, while Clara and Ruth shelled beans and May napped curled in a flour sack like a kitten, Jesse saddled the old mare. You going far? Elias asked, stepping out of the barn. Just to the ridge, Jesse replied. Want to see if the creek's still running. Elias nodded once. Be back before the sun dips. Jesse didn't answer, just touched his hat and rode off with a speed that said he wasn't entirely honest. Clara noticed too. He's been riding out more often. He's watching, Elias said. Watching for what? Elias didn't answer, just glanced toward the horizon. Jesse rode hard until he was sure he was alone. Then he cut east toward Ridgetown, not into the heart of it but close enough to watch the edges. Buildings stood like bones now, hollowed and worn. The mission's chapel had burned long ago. He tied the mare beneath a cluster of twisted mesquites and crouched behind a rise. It didn't take long. A wagon rolled in, pulled by a sweating mule. Two men sat up front, neither wore a badge, but their movements screamed official business. They carried crates into what was left of the schoolhouse, records. Jesse's heart beat hard. He squinted, watching. Then a voice behind him nearly stopped it altogether. "Thought you might come." Jesse spun, reaching for the knife on his belt, but stopped when he saw who it was. Connell. He looked older than Jesse remembered, dustier too, like he'd been living on the wind. "I don't," Jesse started. Connell raised a hand. "I ain't here to drag you back." "Then why?" Connell sat down on the rock beside him, sighing deep. "Same reason you're here, to see what's left." Jesse looked away. "They burned the files." "They're boxing M to send to the capital, or maybe bury in some office where no one will ask questions." "Will they come after us again?" Connell was quiet for a long time. "Not if you lay low, but you'll need those papers soon. A name on a government ledger means you're real. It means you count." "I don't care if I count." "You should, because Ruth does, and May will." Jesse chewed the inside of his cheek. "Why'd you let us go?" Connell shrugged. "Didn't see anyone else treating you like children." They sat in silence a while. Then Connell leaned in. "Word is there's a man named Vasker, used to run the mission's ledgers, got passed over when the system fell apart. He's angry, looking to save face. He might come looking, Jesse, especially if he hears you're living under a rancher's roof and calling it home." Jesse stared hard. "Then we'll be ready." Connell rose. "Get your papers in order soon." With that he walked off, leaving Jesse alone on the hill. That night Jesse returned quiet. Clara noticed his boots were caked in Ridgetown clay but said nothing. She just handed him stew and let him eat in peace. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, Jesse stood on the porch and found Elias smoking his pipe. "Vasker's still around," Jesse said, "and angry." Elias took a long draw before answering. "Then we make sure we're not easy to find." "He might already know." "Then we pray." Jesse looked up at the stars. "I'm not sure how anymore." "You don't have to be sure, just try." The next morning, Elias rode into town. Papers didn't make themselves. He left Clara with a long list of chores and a warning, "Stay close." For a time they did. Until the girl came. It was Ruth who heard the knock. She opened the door before Clara could stop her. The girl was maybe 17, dressed in patched linens, barefoot and breathless. She collapsed on the doorstep before a word could leave her mouth. Clara rushed forward, dragging her inside. Ruth fetched water. May blinked from the corner of the room, unsure. When the girl came to, her lips cracked and bleeding, she whispered, "Please, don't send me back." Clara blinked. "Back where?" The girl shook her head. "Vasker." Jesse, who had just walked in with a bucket of kindling, dropped it so hard it startled May. He crouched. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "Annabelle." Jesse looked to Clara. "He's already looking." Annabelle clutched Clara's sleeve. "He's taking girls, says he's starting over, a new mission, only this time no rules, just obedience." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Jesse stood, fists clenched. "We need Elias," he said. "He's not back yet," Clara replied, heart pounding. Annabelle trembled. "He'll come for me, he always does." They locked the doors that night, pulled the curtains, but no matter how thick the walls, fear crept in like smoke. May cried in her sleep. Ruth didn't eat. Jesse kept a shotgun within reach. And Clara prayed, harder than she had in years. Elias returned the next morning, dusty but triumphant, holding a worn envelope. "Guardianship papers," he said, "stamped, signed, legal." Jesse took them like they were gold. But before the relief could settle, Annabelle screamed. A man stood outside the window, face shadowed by a broad hat, staring in with eyes like dead coals. He didn't knock. He just pointed once, then vanished. Jessie ran outside, but there were no tracks. Clara held Annabelle, who shook so hard she nearly passed out again. Elias shut the door, bolted it, and said, "It's begun." For the first time since the children arrived, the Moore household no longer felt like a home, it felt like a bunker. The laughter that had once floated up from the barn faded into silence. Clara no longer sang while she cooked. Ruth barely left her corner of the kitchen. And Jesse, he moved like a shadow now, slipping in and out of rooms with his jaw tight and his hand near his belt. The stranger hadn't returned since that morning, but his presence lingered like smoke after a fire. Annabelle wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep unless the lantern burned all night. She'd been taken from somewhere dark, and now even safety felt like a trick of the light. Jesse tried to ask more questions, but every time he came near, she flinched. Elias, with a softer approach, managed to coax from her fragments of what had happened. Vasker had taken over an abandoned boarding house 2 towns north. Girls were brought in one by one. Some said they were rescued, but none were ever seen again. "I escaped during the night," Annabelle whispered one evening, eyes fixed on the hearth. "I ran through the back kitchen, out past the livestock pens. I didn't stop. I don't even know how I found your door. It was like something led me here." "Something did," Clara said gently, brushing the girl's damp hair from her face. "You were meant to come." Elias watched from the doorway, arms folded, face unreadable. That night the ranch was quieter than usual. Jesse made 3 full rounds around the property. Elias took the west side, eyes sharp despite the dimming light. Clara stayed up, kneading bread she didn't need just to keep her hands busy. And inside the small bedroom off the kitchen, Annabelle clutched a Bible she found on the windowsill, its pages soft from years of turning. Clara hadn't opened that Bible in too long, but seeing Annabelle with it stirred something in her. She sat beside the girl, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, Clara whispered a prayer she barely remembered. "Lord, let no harm come to this house. Let no shadow cross this threshold without your light to blind it. Amen." Annabelle repeated it after her, barely audible. By morning, no new prints scarred the dirt outside, but everyone still woke with unease crawling up their spines. Elias made a pot of strong coffee and sat at the table with Jesse, who hadn't slept at all. "Vasker's not just watching," Jesse said flatly. "He's hunting." Elias nodded. "We need a plan." "I've got one." And Jesse laid it out. Ridgetown might have been left behind by the law, but there was still one marshal who hadn't sold his badge for silence. A man named Burke, old, grizzled, but too stubborn to walk away. Jesse had met him once when Elias took him into town for supplies. Burke had looked Jesse over like he was trying to read pages only half scrawled, but hadn't turned him away. "If we can get Annabelle's statement in front of him," Jesse said, "and the others, Ruth, maybe he listens." Clara frowned. "But if Vasker's watching, then I draw him away." "No," Elias said, his voice firm. "I will." "No," Jesse said just as fast. "You're the one with a legal name. If this gets bad, they'll need you to stand for them." The room went still. Ruth, listening from the stairs, stepped into view. Her face was pale, but her voice didn't shake. "Then I'll go." They all turned. "You said it yourself. She'll need someone to back her up, someone the law'll believe. I'm old enough to tell what I saw, and Jesse can't go alone." Clara moved before she knew she was moving. "No, Ruth, you're just a—" "I'm not a child," Ruth said, her eyes locked with hers. "Not anymore, not after Ridgetown, and not if it means Annabelle stays safe." Jesse's chest tightened. He looked to Elias, then to Clara, who had begun to cry silently, as if the thought of sending another child into danger broke her all over again. Elias stood. "Then we go at dawn." The plan was simple, but nothing about it felt safe. Jesse, Ruth, and Annabelle would take the wagon as far as Cold Hollow Ridge and wait in the pines. Elias would ride ahead to meet with Burke. If the marshal agreed to help, they'd bring Annabelle into town for the official record. If not, they'd disappear again. Clara packed the wagon in silence. Every stitch of clothing she laid down felt like a goodbye. She hugged May until the girl squirmed, then kissed Jesse's cheek and Ruth's forehead, her hands trembling. "Come back," she whispered, "all of you." Jesse looked into her eyes. "We will." The wagon rolled out just as the sun scraped the rim of the world, casting gold across the desert. Elias rode ahead, dust rising in a low trail behind him. They made it to the ridge by mid-afternoon. Jesse led the horses into a shaded grove. Ruth gathered firewood without being asked, and Annabelle stayed curled in the back of the wagon, holding that worn Bible like a compass. Jesse sat beside her. "You're safe now," he said. "No one ever is," she murmured, "not when he wants you." Jesse didn't argue, he just looked out over the hills. But as the sun lowered, he noticed something wrong. The dust trail from Elias had stopped far too soon. Jesse climbed to the highest rock he could find and scanned the distance. No rider, no Elias. No Burke. Only stillness. Then from far behind them, back down the path they'd come, dust rose again. But this time it was coming toward them. Vast. He jumped down and ran back to the wagon. "Ruth, pack it all now." What? "Don't ask, just move." Annabelle sat up wide-eyed. "Vasker," she whispered. Jesse didn't answer. Ruth grabbed the bags and threw them into the wagon bed. Jesse yanked the reins, but the horses were already nervous, stamping hard. He scanned the road behind them, and there, just cresting the ridge, they saw them. 3 riders, one wore black, one rode with a limp swaying strangely. The third he was too far to see clearly, but Jesse knew, he could feel it. Vasker. He didn't chase, he simply followed. The message was clear, you cannot run far enough. "We have to split," Jesse said. "They want her, not us." "No," Annabelle gasped. "They'll take anyone, he always does." Jesse thought hard. "There's a cave 2 miles east, narrow, only one way in." "You can't fight them alone," Ruth said. "I'm not planning to fight." "But—" He turned. "Ruth, you've seen worse than this. You know when to run." Her eyes filled with tears. She nodded. He handed her the reins. "You take her, take May, take Clara, get far." "What about Elias?" "If he's still with Burke, he'll catch up." "And if not?" Jesse didn't answer. He simply turned and ran toward the oncoming riders. Jesse didn't have a gun, didn't have a badge. All he had was time, and he was burning it like kindling as he ran straight into the path of 3 men who made a life out of ending others. The dry wind whipped his coat behind him as his boots thundered over the gravel. He wasn't charging them with a plan. He was just buying minutes. That's all Annabelle needed, minutes to disappear, minutes to live. The first rider slowed when he spotted the man running toward them. The one in black reached for his belt, but Vasker didn't break pace. His horse was a monstrous gray, tall as a gatepost and twice as stubborn. He raised one hand and the others halted, dust clouds settling beneath them. Jesse came to a stop 10 paces away, chest heaving, sweat already streaking dirt down his neck. He didn't speak. Neither did they. For a long, stretched moment it was just silence. Then Vasker dismounted. The creak of his boots hitting the earth made Jesse's throat tighten. "You look different," Vasker said, voice slick with false cheer. "Cleaner than I remember. That boy in Ridge Town always looked like he belonged under a wagon, not in front of one." Jesse's fists clenched. "You don't belong near any of them." "I never forced anything, not one thing. They come because they're desperate. You know how that works." Vasker smiled. "Orphan girls, lonely men, I just bring 'em together." "You buy them." You think you're any better? Vasker tilted his head. You think bringing her to a pretty house with painted walls makes you holy. You're just a man with better manners. She still sleeps with fear under her ribs, don't she? She's not yours to speak of. I think you forget everything and everyone has a price, even you. Jesse took a step forward. You remember Ridgetown. Vasker's smile faded. You remember what happened when you tried to buy me too. I was 12. You raised a hand to me and I didn't flinch then. I won't flinch now. Behind him the riders shifted, uncertain. Vasker's eyes narrowed. So that's why you looked familiar. Yeah. You were the little mutt who bit my hand when I tried to pull you out the cellar. You were the first monster I ever saw. And then Jesse did something reckless. He reached down, picked up a stone, and threw it at the foot of Vasker's horse. The beast reared and snorted, forcing the men to move, and in that moment Jesse turned and ran. Not away, but sideways, toward the ridge's edge, where the ground fell fast into a ravine. The only way to the cave was down that ravine, tight, treacherous. No way 3 horses could chase him there. Bullets cracked behind him, kicking up dust beside his heels, but he didn't stop. He dove, rolled, slid, tumbled over rocks until his arms were scraped raw and his ribs screamed with every breath. Still, he didn't stop. Because somewhere behind him, Ruth was racing the wagon east, and Annabelle, who had almost been forgotten by the world, was in that wagon too, still breathing, still fighting. He didn't even notice the blood until he hit the canyon floor. His arm was gashed open. His left boot had torn clean in half, but he staggered to his feet and started toward the cave. He didn't plan on hiding, not exactly. He planned on trapping them. The cave wasn't much. A jagged cleft between 2 slabs of stone. Jesse ducked in, heart hammering. He listened. Nothing yet. He had minutes, maybe less. Using loose rocks and a crooked beam from a collapsed mine post nearby, he rigged a crude wedge above the entrance. If one of them followed, he'd bring it down. He wasn't strong, but weight and leverage made up for it. That was one thing he learned young, how to survive with less. Then he sat down, pressed his back to the wall, and waited. Footsteps eventually echoed down the trail. 1 man, Jesse counted the cadence. 2 light for Vasker. 2 fast for the limping one. The 3rd. Come on, Jesse whispered. Come closer. The footsteps paused, then a voice gravelly and unsure. I saw you run, that was smart, but now you're boxed in. Jesse stayed silent. You can't climb out, might as well talk to me. Still Jesse waited. You protected her, the man said. So what? He'll just take another. You didn't save anything. You delayed it. Jesse gripped the rock in his hand. Come out now, I won't shoot. A lie. Jesse saw the shadow lengthen, boots entering the mouth of the cave. Now. He pulled the cord. The wedge broke. The beam fell, slammed into the pile of loose stone. With a roar like thunder, the entrance collapsed. Dust blinded him for a moment. Then all he heard was coughing, cursing, and silence. He waited a full minute before crawling forward to peer through the thin crack left in the rocks. The man was pinned, alive maybe, but not moving. Jesse slumped back against the cave wall, chest shaking. Elsewhere, Ruth didn't look back. She drove the wagon until her arms burned and the sun started to fade. Annabelle lay curled beside her, clinging to the seat as the trail jostled them. They made it to the base of a small canyon, then took shelter beneath an overhang. Ruth built a fire the way Jesse taught her, slow, patient. She wrapped Annabelle in a wool blanket and held her tight. You're safe, she whispered. Annabelle didn't cry. She just looked at Ruth with those hollow eyes and asked the question Ruth had been dreading. Is he coming back? Ruth swallowed. He promised, and Jesse doesn't break promises. Back at the ranch, Clara kept watch from the porch. Every creak of the windmill, every rustle of sagebrush made her jump. She had May inside with her, busy with puzzles and bread dough and anything else to keep her little mind from wandering to worse things. Elias hadn't returned. Clara lit a lantern and set it on the fence post. "If you're out there," she whispered into the wind, "come home." In the cave, Jesse drifted in and out of consciousness. Hunger gnawed at him, pain throbbed, but still he stayed alert. Then a new sound, one that didn't belong. Footsteps again, but heavier, familiar. "Jesse." He jolted upright. "Elias." The rocks shifted, a sliver of light broke through, then more. Then Elias' face appeared through the crack, lined with sweat and fear. "Hang on, I've got you." It took nearly an hour, but Elias cleared the rocks enough to pull Jesse out. He was limping, bruised, but alive. How'd you?" "I met Burke," Elias said. "He agreed, but when we saw the trail, saw where they went, we followed." "Burke?" "Right behind me, with 2 deputies. And sure enough, through the trees came horses and men with rifles, lawmen, real ones. Vasquer's trail had been burned into the dust. It wasn't over, not yet. But it was changing. And Jesse, for the first time in his life, wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting. Jesse could barely stand when they hoisted him onto Elias' horse. His legs were torn, his back stiff with blood and dirt, but the sight of daylight and the cool hand of a friend on his shoulder pulled breath back into his lungs. He didn't ask questions, not about how Burke had changed his mind, or why Elias had disobeyed every warning to ride straight into danger. Jesse didn't care. All he cared about was getting back to them. To Annabelle. To Ruth. To the strange, broken, stitched-together family God had handed him in the middle of his desert-lonely life. Burke rode up beside them, squinting down the ravine. We followed the prince, saw Vasquer veer off west, the rest scattered like cowards. Jesse swayed in the saddle, but his voice was firm. "We need to get to the girls." "We will." Elias said they were heading east. Jesse nodded. "There's a box canyon with an old trapper's shelter. Ruth knows it." Burke turned to his men. "You heard him, let's ride." They pushed hard. Jesse's body begged for rest, but his spirit pushed him upright. The sun was bleeding orange across the horizon when they saw the first sign: ashes. A fire long cold. Wagon tracks half covered by wind-blown dust. Then Ruth's shawl caught on a juniper branch. And Annabelle's boot prints, so small Jesse could have wept just seeing them. They followed until night fell, and still they rode. Lanterns lit the way, the pale flickering light bouncing shadows across the brush. Coyotes howled in the distance. But Jesse heard something else, a voice, small, familiar. "Uncle Jesse." "Ruth." He nearly fell off the horse trying to get down. She came running out of the dark, skirts flying, tears already on her face. When she collided into his arms, Jesse held her like he never meant to let go again. She didn't speak, just buried her face against him and sobbed. Annabelle stood a few feet away, stiff, watching. Her arms wrapped tight around her middle like she couldn't believe the reunion was real. Jesse turned to her. Their eyes didn't meet, couldn't, but when she heard his voice, her chin lifted. "You made it," he said softly. "I waited," she whispered. He reached for her hand, and when her small fingers wrapped around his, something inside him cracked wide open. Grief, love, shame, and something like hope all at once. "You did more than wait," he said. "You believed." The next morning, with the law finally riding at their back, Jesse brought the girls home. Clara cried when she saw them, and so did May. The porch overflowed with the weight of all they'd nearly lost. Annabelle was given a warm bath, clean clothes, and a bed near the stove. She didn't speak much, but she smiled when May offered her a crust of bread. And when Clara brushed out her tangled hair and whispered prayers over her, she didn't pull away. For the first time in years, Annabelle didn't sleep alone. Ruth wouldn't leave Jesse's side. She made him tea, scrubbed his wounds, and slept on the floor beside his cot in case he needed anything. He told her to rest, but she refused. "You do it for me," was all she said. And he would, he'd do it again. Burke and his men stayed a few days longer, rounding up the scattered outlaws. Vasker was gone, vanished into the canyon country like a snake into brush, but Burke promised they'd keep hunting. "We'll get him," the marshal said, tipping his hat. "You just keep living. That's the best vengeance for men like him." Spring came. Slowly, the scars of the past winter began to fade. Jesse walked without limping. The garden flourished again. Clara baked pies and let May run barefoot in the tall grass. Annabelle remained quiet but no longer withdrawn. She started sitting at the table during meals. She brushed her own hair. She helped Ruth with the laundry, and once, when Jesse returned from the barn covered in dust, she laughed. A soft, breathy thing, but enough to make the whole room turn and smile. She still didn't talk about her past. Jesse didn't ask. What mattered was the now. One evening, Jesse sat with her on the porch, the sun melting behind the hills. He cleared his throat. "There's a doctor in San Miguel. He's seen cases like yours." She turned toward him, expression unreadable. "He might be able to help," Jesse continued. "No promises, but if there's a way to help you see again, I'd want to try." Annabelle looked down. "I don't need to see." Jesse blinked. "Why?" "Because I already see the important things. I see you, I see Ruth, I see safety." He didn't argue, but something stuck in his throat like a prayer left unsaid. A week later, she changed her mind. Ruth packed their bags. Clara kissed her forehead. And Jesse drove her to San Miguel. The doctor was kind, professional. He examined her for over an hour, and when he turned to Jesse with a soft nod, Jesse's knees nearly gave out. "It's possible," the doctor said. "She'll need rest, patience, but I can help." Annabelle was silent the whole ride home. That night, as Jesse lit the lantern beside her bed, she reached for his hand. "If I see again," she whispered, "will you be here?" He didn't hesitate. "I'll be here." Will you still want me, even if I chain?" He knelt beside her, hand over hers. "I've wanted you since the day you asked me not to leave." "But you couldn't see me." "No," he said softly, "but I saw everything I needed." The operation came 2 weeks later. Jesse held her hand the whole time. She woke with bandages over her eyes. They waited, day by day, until finally the doctor returned, and with slow, trembling hands unwrapped the gauze. Annabelle blinked against the light. It hurt. Everything was blurred, shapes and colors swirling like water. Then a face, worn, weathered, eyes filled with fear and hope. "Jesse," she whispered. He didn't speak. She reached out, touched his cheek, and smiled. "You're handsomer than I imagined." He laughed through the tears he hadn't realized were falling. "I was just hoping not to scare you off." "You didn't," she said. "You never could." And when he took her hand again, it wasn't with trembling or doubt. It was steady, certain. "Annabelle," he said, voice raw, would you stay?" She didn't answer with words. She just leaned forward, forehead pressed against his, and whispered the one thing he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. "Yes." Annabelle's healing wasn't just in her eyes. It was in the way she stood taller when she walked through the ranch gate again, in the way she reached for Ruth's hand, unafraid of being the one leading now, in the way she turned to Jesse that same evening and asked if she could help saddle a horse for the first time in her life. She was shaky, nervous, but Jesse handed her the bridle with a smile that said, "You're not alone," and that made all the difference. The children watched her like she was something out of a storybook, Ruth especially, who had never known what it meant to have an older sister. Annabelle taught her how to braid her hair and showed her how to mend a hem properly, but she also taught her something more, how to stand still and let someone love you without fear. Ruth learned that from the way Annabelle looked at Jesse, from the way her voice softened when she said his name. And Jesse, he changed too, not in the loud, dramatic way men often do, but in the quiet settling of his soul. He smiled more. He prayed more often, though he didn't always use words. Sometimes he just sat by the porch steps, hands folded, watching the sky with the kind of peace that comes only after years of storm. They married on a warm day in June. There wasn't a crowd, just Clara, May, Ruth, and a few good neighbors who rode in with cakes and hand-stitched linens. Annabelle wore a simple white dress sewn by Clara, and Jesse shaved for the first time in weeks, his boots polished so bright they caught the sun. Ruth was the one who gave Annabelle away. She held her hand all the way to the altar, just a small wooden arch near the tree Jesse had planted the year his wife passed. The same tree where he used to sit and wonder if his life had any more pages left to turn. Now it bloomed. As they said their vows, Jesse's voice cracked once, but not from nerves, from gratitude. "I didn't know I could still be loved," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Annabelle smiled, brushing a tear from his cheek. "You always were, you just didn't see it." They lived simply. Annabelle never craved attention or riches. All she wanted was to know the people she loved were fed, warm, and safe. She kept teaching Ruth how to read by lantern light. She joined Clara in planting herbs by the kitchen window. She and Jesse built a cradle from the same wood that held up their front porch. They didn't speak much about her past, not because it was forgotten, but because she no longer lived inside it. Sometimes, when the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, she'd sit with Jesse and tell him little things. About her father's old guitar, about the sound of her mother's voice humming lullabies she hadn't heard in years. And Jesse would listen with that steady, unwavering patience that made her feel like those pieces weren't broken at all, just waiting to be carried forward. Once, Ruth asked Annabelle if she missed being blind. It was a child's question, honest, pure. Annabelle had paused for a long time before answering. "I miss how clearly I saw people's hearts," she finally said. "Sometimes, when you see everything on the outside, you forget what really matters." "But you still see hearts," Ruth had whispered. "You saw Uncle Jesse's." Annabelle smiled and kissed her forehead. "And yours too." Trouble didn't stay away forever. It never does. One fall evening, a man from her past showed up at the ranch gate. He was older now, scarred from a life wasted on anger and gambling. He wore his guilt like a second skin and couldn't even meet her eyes when he spoke. "I was wrong," he said simply, "and I came to say I'm sorry." Jesse didn't move from the porch. Annabelle stepped forward, standing between her husband and the man who had once tried to sell her as if she were nothing more than weight in a ledger. She didn't shout, didn't cry, just looked him in the eye for a long time and said, "I forgive you." And Jesse reached for her hand again, and they watched the man ride away, smaller with every step, until he was nothing more than a shadow on the horizon. That night they held each other closer. Not out of fear, but because grace had never felt so real. Years passed. Ruth grew into a young woman, fierce and gentle in equal measure. She married a quiet blacksmith from town and built a home just a few hills over from the ranch. Jesse walked her down the aisle, and Annabelle cried more than the bride did. Clara lived long enough to see her grandnieces running wild through the orchard she'd planted. May grew up to teach school, and the little cradle Jesse and Annabelle built eventually held not just one baby, but 3. Each one named with care. Each one taught from the start that family isn't made by blood alone. Jesse never forgot the day he bought a girl he couldn't even see. Never forgot the sound of her voice when she promised she could heal him. She did, in ways no doctor ever could. And when the world grew still in their final years, when the porch creaked under the weight of age and the nights came earlier, Jesse would sit beside Annabelle, her hand in his, and thank God not for riches or fame or even for healing, but for second chances, and for the eyes to see them when they came. 3 years later, the ranch looked different, not in shape or size, but in how it felt. The fences were still the same crooked rails Jesse had hammered together decades ago. The barn still groaned at night when the wind passed over it, but laughter echoed more often now, rising from open windows and drifting across the fields like music only the grateful could hear. Annabelle stood by the porch with her youngest on her hip, a boy with Jesse's solemn eyes and her stubborn chin. He babbled nonsense at the chickens, and she replied with a mock-serious tone that sent him into fits of giggles. It was ordinary, but for a woman who once sat in silence, blind and alone, every sound now was a hymn. Inside, Ruth's daughter helped May arrange books on the shelf Jesse had finally built after 10 years of promising he would. The house had filled with grandchildren, nieces, neighbors, and orphans who had long since been folded into the family as if they'd always belonged. Jesse no longer rose before the sun like he used to. His steps had slowed, and his joints spoke louder than his words some mornings, but he still saddled a horse every now and then, still insisted on mending the fence posts himself, still kissed Annabelle's hand every night before bed, no matter how tired they were. Once, after a particularly long afternoon of chasing children and shucking corn, Jesse had sat down beside her, their legs touching, and whispered, "I think I finally understand what it means to be healed." Annabelle hadn't spoken. She just leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, because peace like that didn't need words. That fall they hosted a harvest dinner. Long tables set out beneath the cottonwoods, food passed down in warm dishes, stories told in flickers of candlelight and fire. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a pie that reminded Jesse of his mother. And as the stars blinked into the sky, Annabelle sang an old hymn, her voice low and sure, and every head bowed not in sorrow, but in thanks. They were not young anymore, but they were whole. And in that little patch of land where a blind rancher once lived alone, and where a broken girl once begged for freedom, a family had taken root, not one born of chance but of choice, of grace, of love that never asked for proof. The kind of love that sees clearly, even in the dark.